The next talk is an opportunity also to discuss several issues in the class struggle internationally, especially the very basic question of China. Now, does the People's Republic of China have a right to defend its sovereignty in the waters surrounding China? And what are U.S. aircraft carriers and destroyers and nuclear submarines and bombers and underwater drones doing in the South China Sea? China doesn't have any such force in the Gulf of Mexico, which is about the same size, bordered about the same number of countries. Yet, China is depicted as an aggressor in the South China Sea. There's a new documentary made by the filmmaker John Pilger, and the opening lines, it's called The Coming War on China. The opening lines say, "Today, more than 400 American military bases encircle China with missiles, bombers, warships, and above all, nuclear weapons. From Australia north through the Pacific to Japan, Korea, and across Eurasia to Afghanistan and India, the bases form, as one U.S. strategist put it, the perfect noose. The greatest buildup of NATO military forces since the Second World War is underway on the western borders of Russia. On the other side of the world, the rise of China as the world's second economic power is viewed in Washington as another threat to American dominance." It's just the opening lines of this movie, but it really sums up the situation that China is facing today. Now, increasingly, there's hundreds of news stories that the big problem facing the U.S. is China. China's the aggressor. China's a superpower that's throwing its weight around. China is militarizing the South China Sea. And what the U.S. is doing is just defending the people of the region, especially the interests of the smaller nations who also border the South China Sea. For us here, we're pretty clear on one point, that there's nowhere in the world that the U.S. military or the police or the intelligence agencies are defending the interests of working and oppressed people or smaller nations. That's like ABC. Not in Standing Rock, not in Syria, not in Palestine, not in Ukraine, or in the Philippines, or in Russia, or in China. Not in South Korea or Haiti, and not in New York City, or Baltimore, or Ferguson, or LA. This is ABC for all of us here. And making those links is a very important part of what we do. Now, demonization, especially of black and brown people here in the U.S., a constant demonization of immigrants and of Muslims, it creates a racist atmosphere that runs so deep. The media is absolutely pre-programmed. They already know the script. So it's easy to whip up fear and demonization against China. They know what buttons to push. Now, there are a lot of people who do understand and see through U.S. lies on one struggle because their own experience has taught them not to trust the corporate media or the promises of politicians. So they may understand to abolish NATO that's encircling Russia and China, or abolish the Zionist military army of occupation of all of Palestine, or abolish the police in New York City. Right? And we want to show the links of all these struggles. It's the role of the party to explain constantly. It's the same police apparatus wearing different hats. Now, there are a few terms I want to use tonight. It's really useful to explain. One of them, especially if we're going to talk about China, is free trade. Now, free trade has nothing to do with human freedom. It was originally a term based on the freedom of the capitalists to carry out the African slave trade. It was the capitalists claiming the right to property, to the buying and selling of human beings, that this was a sacred right. And the capitalists described the transatlantic slave trade as the bedrock of global free trade. And it had all the protection of law in every capitalist country. It was the cornerstone of free enterprise. Now, free trade meant something else in China. In the early 1800s, free trade meant the right of the British capitalists to freely trade opium in China without any restriction from the Chinese government. It forced the Chinese market, they said, was going to be forced open. And the Chinese government was determined to stop the opium trade. So imposing free trade of opium on China meant war with China. It meant occupation and conquest and pillage. It meant British merchants who wanted the silk and the tea and the porcelain and the spices for markets in the West, but they refused to pay in silver. They demanded the right to pay in opium. And their gunboats smashed the Chinese Navy. There were 2 wars called the First Opium War and the Second Opium War, 1839 and then 1856, where they literally roared into the harbors of China, burned the cities. This was on the coast and into the rivers of China. And they did succeed in imposing the opium trade. Now, the British ships coming in to the Chinese rivers and the coastal areas, they called this freedom of navigation, that these gunboats had the right to go everywhere. And it had, again, nothing to do with freedom for you or me or anyone in this room or anyone of our class. Freedom of navigation meant the freedom to send gunboats to impose free trade, and to do so very violently. For more than 100 years, the imperialists invoked this freedom of navigation to completely dominate Chinese trade. And U.S. and British gunboats controlled not just the coastal areas, but China's Yangtze and Yellow and Pearl River. They had a whole fleet of river gunboats that controlled the rivers 1,300 and 1,500 miles up the Yangtze River. That's not a small operation. And any Chinese merchants had warehouses who they wanted to impose a new agreement, well, they could just blast that warehouse right out of existence. It was a very brutal process. And their ability to reach into every major Chinese river, every major city of China, and to protect their, quote, business interests, it was a free looting of China, and it was what China still calls the unequal treaties that were imposed on them. And this was the same era when, of course, the U.S. was imposing unequal treaties on indigenous peoples right here as they stole the land, ripped the resources away, and carried out a genocide right here. Finally, in 1949, with a successful Chinese Revolution, the People's Liberation Army kicked all the foreign forces and their hated battleships from the rivers of China, and they began a socialist construction in an absolutely impoverished country that had been robbed and looted for decades. Mao's famous quote on the day of asserting was, "The Chinese people have stood up." It was a monumental declaration that they would control their own country, their own resources, and push out the foreign powers that had dominated China. It was a monumental accomplishment, and it was earth-shaking, and it really was earth-shaking to U.S. imperialism, who began the witch hunt over who lost China, and blaming many forces right here of the progressive and the communist movement. From the very first minute, U.S. imperialism was completely hostile to People's China's very existence. Now, China, after the revolution, was still desperately poor, largely illiterate peasant population, and lacking of the most basic industries and infrastructure, and sanctioned and isolated from world trade. In the past 30 years, China has been able to develop industry and infrastructure by making many compromises and deals and concessions to imperialism and big openings to the capitalist market. Today, they're large Chinese capitalists and big Western and also Japanese capitalist firms operating in China. This is true. But People's China still maintains a very large planned economy, and a very significant part of the economy is still socially owned, and particularly in areas of the banking and the communication and infrastructure, the most basic industries. Really, China still maintains that control. The Communist Party still has decisive authority, and real control is placed on foreign-owned industries that poured into China to take advantage of much lower wages. There are entire industries that were just uprooted from the U.S. and also from other countries in order to take advantage of a time of lower wages. What they resented was the right of Chinese workers to unionize, even in foreign-owned industries, or the insistence on the part of the Chinese government that the profits can't be just taken right out of China. They have to be reinvested, or that the industries in time will be owned by China. These were all, the U.S. didn't have that agreement with any other country around the world. They're used to setting the terms and doing exactly what they want, and they resent every one of these restrictions that has been placed on them. They're especially threatened. The Chinese Communist Party has 83 million members, and they are pretty committed to collective ownership and to keeping society organized in a way that does benefit the overwhelming majority of the population. Now, there are a lot of people who've equated the deals made with imperialism by claiming that China, as its economy has developed, has now become an imperialist country. And from Workers' World, we feel that this completely misunderstands what imperialism is. As Lenin explained, that imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, that complete merger of the banks, the largest industries and corporations, defended by a monstrous military machine. Imperialism needs war, because if capitalism can't constantly expand, it literally suffocates. It's driven to capture new markets, and that drive is ruthless. Any country breaking away from imperialist exploitation threatens the very existence and the future of imperialism. So they hate every one of the controls in China, and they're always trying to gain the upper hand and force new trade agreements. And this is really what the pivot to Asia is all about. How to surround and threaten China and impose and force new concessions. And to do so militarily. And it's interesting, they have revived and asserted this term as they bring their warships and their battleships into the area, that these are just freedom of navigation operations. Now you can imagine how that resonates in China and what they know that the U.S. is planning to do, because they've lived it before. Now, as the U.S. Navy sees it, they said, well, China has a rather unique interpretation of international law. They feel that there should be no freedom of navigation for warships and military airplanes and overflight. That there should only be freedom of navigation for commercial ships of every country. Imagine that. I mean, and this is true. Again and again, China's drawn the distinction between commercial and military vessels. The Chinese Foreign Ministry stated that no country except the United States believes in military vessels sailing wherever they want. And it isn't just in China. The sail into times past the harbors in Nicaragua and Venezuela and impose in Cuba and the Philippines to take the agreements, the treaties, the concessions that they want. So now we hear that China is militarizing the South China Sea by building air bases on 7 small islands. And as a matter of fact, Donald Trump tweeted that China is building a massive fortress in the middle of the South China Sea. These are expanded mini-islands, but they're not the threat to world peace that the U.S. media is describing. But they have a very interesting explanation. I really got a lot out of this. That the Chinese Defense Ministry put out a statement just on their website, very low-key, on December 16th, where they announced that they're going to arm these mini-islands that has been built out of sand and reef of existing islands with defensive anti-ship missiles. China said they're primarily for defense and self-protection, and this is proper and legitimate. For instance, if someone was at the door of your home, cocky and swaggering, how could it be that you wouldn't prepare a slingshot? It's kind of a low-key statement put on their website, but they're sending a message. Now, Washington demanded that China immediately stop this construction, and it's carried out several very threatening freedom of navigation operations close to these mini islands, again and again in the last year and a half. Last time they did it, Chinese military responded by scrambling some fighter jets that swooped in on this this U.S. destroyer, ordering them to leave Chinese territory or face engagement. Then they dispatched 3 Chinese warships and again officially said leave Chinese water and airspace. And then on December 17th, and this was a day after they put this little notice about that they're preparing a slingshot, they snatched an underwater drone from a U.S. Navy ship, the Bowditch. And now this drone, it's not just a little drone. It's actually charting the waters in China for U.S. submarines, and also they want to know where Chinese submarines are and where the channels. The South China Sea has a lot of reefs and rocky areas and whatnot. They're also investigating these islands, where these little islands where China has put some defense missiles. So they snatched the drone, made a message. They said, we have a right to. It's in Chinese waters. Thank you very much. They then announced, I think it was 2 days later, they'll hand the drone back. But all of this is about the pivot to Asia, which is a very provocative action. Really, the U.S. plan calls for moving 2/3 of the U.S. Navy to Asia and the Pacific and aiming their weapons at China. So that movie that Polger is making, The Coming War on China, doesn't say with, on China. It's pretty accurate. Now, also, these confrontations are coming at a time in the South China Sea when the U.S. Navy really needs to justify its biggest expansion in 35 years. And there's billions and hundreds of billions of dollars at stake in this expansion of the military. There's presently 273 battle-ready ships. This includes destroyers and aircraft carriers and all kinds of nuclear submarines, which with one launch could end life on this planet. At any rate, they have 273. And with Obama's pivot to Asia, they were going to increase this to 308. That's a big expansion. But Trump pledged that this had to be expanded to 350 ships. Now, that is a pretty humongous military expansion, and it involves tens and tens of billions of dollars. The U.S. Navy immediately responded by putting forth a plan for 355 ships. So, you know, now, just to explain what one aircraft carrier will do, the U.S. now has 11 aircraft carriers. They're floating fortresses. They are the military islands. They're talking about China putting some, but these aircraft carriers really are floating militarized islands. One of the ship that they keep announcing they're going to launch in the next couple of months, they spent $13 billion. It's a super aircraft carrier called the USS General Ford, and it's designed to dominate the seas. It'll be the most expensive and advanced warship ever built. It can house more than 4,500 military personnel and launch 45 aircraft bombers at a rate of one every 45 seconds. It's pretty incredible. And then it has radar that enable this huge ship and the aircraft on it to remain stealthy and very difficult to detect by these powerful signals it sets off. It's as long as the height of the Empire State Building, and it towers 20 stories in the air. Most incredible, it has a flight deck that is 4.5 acres.
Oh my God.
So just picture the size of this monstrous piece of equipment. It's a massive, this is the U.S. Navy brags about it as a massive investment in strategic dominance. That's how they call it. And this aircraft carrier doesn't travel alone. It travels with a whole carrier strike group of destroyers and other warships and nuclear submarines and logistics ships and supply ships and another about 4,000 military personnel and all these other ships that go in a traveler carrier group. So just keeping that operating costs about $2 to $4 billion a year. Building this fabulously expensive new ship, it guarantees long-term profits, decades of cost overruns for the largest U.S. corporations. I'm talking General Dynamics, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, BAE Systems, Boeing, Northrop Grumman. That's who cashes in huge profits. Power suppliers like General Electric and Babcock and Wilcox and so on. It's so costly that it will rob every social program that hasn't already been gutted in past military expenditures. Now, that's what this expansion is all about. More guaranteed super profits for years into the future to the largest corporations. Now, the last question is sort of why is the South China Sea so important? The South China Sea, as I say, it's about the size of the Gulf of Mexico, and it links the Indian and the Pacific Ocean. But about half the merchant ships in the world pass through the South China Sea. So keeping it open for commercial navigation is a top priority for China and for all the countries of the region who are very dependent on this trade. 80% of China's oil passes through the narrow Malacca Straits and then into the coastal and river cities of China. The ship traffic in this area is 3 times greater than what passes through the Suez Canal and 5 times more than what passes through the Panama Canal. So it's a very strategic and concentrated area. And a blockade by the U.S. Navy with their aircraft carriers could strangle China's economy and also devastate all the countries of the region. And we know this. U.S. war in Syria is devastating for every country in the Middle East. That wars radiate out and create real horror for all the people of the region. Now, China has claimed the majority of the South China Sea for centuries. I mean, this isn't a new question, a new issue. And they're determined, this is a country of 1.3 billion people, not to relinquish their sovereign rights to protect and defend this piece of Chinese territory. They base their claim even on what's called the 9-dash line, which was put forth by the Kuomintang government at a time when it was recognized by the U.S. There are parts of the South China Sea that are also claimed by Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan, Vietnam. And really what the U.S. has done is attempted to strike deals and exert enormous pressure on these countries to force alliances against China by claiming to be a protector of small nations and their rights. And very much there is an effort, and we hope and expect it will continue, for People's China to reach equitable agreements with all the countries of the surrounding area. but knowing that everyone's rights and future are at stake with what happens with the U.S. military. This is what has really set back U.S. plans. The decision by President Duterte in the Philippines to open relations with China, and this was announced in a state visit in late October, and the step back from being a U.S. pawn. Now, this sent shockwaves because the U.S. was planning a whole series of bases on islands that are really also kind of rocky outcroppings, very close to what China was building. And they wanted a big expansion on these bases. They also used the Philippines to take China to what they said was an international court. They said this was a UN court and it had ruled against China on this. I actually looked it up. I found out had no connection to the UN, and it wasn't even a court. It was like an arbitration company that rented some space in the building where the World Court is housed, but they didn't even arbitrate. They just went there with some papers that the Philippine government had signed off on and came back with a ruling supposedly against China. China said, well, this firm was set up in 1899 to protect, imperialist interests and didn't hold any power over us. But it was interesting because in all the news coverage here, they said international UN court had found against China in the South China Sea. Right? Complete fraud. It's more fake news, like we get every day on every country and every struggle. Now, this area holds also the richest fisheries in the world and possible rich deposits of oil and natural gas. And it was also the center of the effort of what was called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, this was an effort by U.S. capitalism to form a trade alliance of 11 what are called Pacific Rim countries, and that extends from Chile, right over to East Asia. All the key countries excluding China. And it was meant to be leverage on China. Now, it had so many onerous clauses in it as to what it would do for working people in the U.S. and Canada and every other country, and doing away with any environmental controls and be impossible to sue any company if you could hurt their profits. I mean, there are all kinds of clauses in this. It became an international campaign to stop the TPP. And even in the election campaign, you had both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump talking against the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and it finally went down in defeat. Now that's a big setback for U.S. plans. So, and their plan against China to try to exert enormous economic leverage. So they've had two setbacks in the past couple of months in their plans to, both militarily and using other countries and using a trade alliance to push China back. Now, that doesn't mean imperialism accepts defeat. That may bring more reckless threats, and that is what sailing aircraft carriers into the region means. But I think we should be really prepared for crisis, quick news ahead, never believe any stories, and we should never forget the Gulf of Tonkin when the U.S. was opening a war on Vietnam, where they claimed some U.S. destroyers were hit by Vietnamese PT boats, and they went to Congress that very afternoon and got a resolution of war. It happened so fast, and it was a complete fraud. It was a complete fraud. So, and we could go all the way back to Remember the Maine. So I'm going to wind up on that. We should never believe any of the news coming out. This is the way U.S. imperialism operates around the world and right here at home. And it's meant to set people against each other. It's meant to impose through military domination and fear. And we actually applaud the resistance of the people of China, whether it's in building a slingshot or it's in holding on to their own economy. I wanted to first comment on Nate's report, and also I think we gotta, and the People's Power is really showing how to do this, not be intimidated by the Trump threats, because it's a different era in many ways. The national surveillance state is enormous, but the ability of people to communicate instantaneously and respond has never been greater in any time in human history. I mean, it's sort of staggering, and there's a whole generation that is learning to siphon through a lot of the propaganda. We can do a lot to help this, but it is stunning that, like, why do they have to try to, in every way, for example, in Syria, sell this war? Because no matter how many stories they push, anytime they do a poll, the overwhelming majority of the population is still against any U.S. involvement. So they've had to do it through contractors and mercenaries and secret plans, and through Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Turkey and Israel and all kinds of other countries, but they fear directly taking it on. They fear directly having a large U.S. military, that they won't be able to hold on to their own troops. I think John Catalanato is writing an entire book on that, but they can lose their grip very quickly, and that's what we have to really look toward. The response the other night to this horrendous attack was instantaneous, and then also thoughtful, how to really respond and organize. And that's where we have to take a lot of confidence that it's not generations ago. Certain gains have been made by the working class in the U.S. and internationally, and that's also what Chinese Revolution represents too. And there's a determination not to lose hold of that. And I think we need to take very seriously what's coming up, and yet in every way, such as is being done, build resistance to it, and show that resistance is possible. And also inevitable, because they can't offer anything better. This is a problem they face that earlier times couldn't, I know this is off track, but see, FDR, Roosevelt, as a way out of the Great Depression, could offer a huge, vast jobs program with World War II. But they've had this huge, inflated military ever since, and it's no longer enough to pull them out. Even a Navy that is this astronomical, they're going to build aircraft carriers and nuclear subs and destroyers to, instead of infrastructure right here. Provides very few jobs, won't solve their problems. It's profitable for the corporations, but it won't solve their problems, and that's what we should take real confidence in, because in an earlier time, it could, in a short-term way. Now, I was asked a few questions, so let me switch gears. But it does directly connect to what Kazem was saying. Is the balance of the world changing? And it sure is. It sure is. U.S. imperialism is in decline. It's decaying in the most horrendous and disgusting ways, and we feel that here. This is not, a time of its ascendancy. It's decaying in 100 ways, and its infrastructure, its political infrastructure, is also in total decay. Its hold on the population here, both political parties, who are the most hated, even when they look at who registers Republican and Democrat, the majority or registering independent. That's a problem for the ruling class. It means that the political parties that they've just had an allegiance to, it's decaying in all kinds of ways, but it's really their hold on the loyalty of working people here that is just fraying in 100 ways. And that was really what Hillary Clinton was up against, capitalist decay, and it wasn't Russia that did it. And I'm so glad we addressed that in an earlier meeting, but we got to say that again and again. Russia didn't do it, capitalism did. This is who's responsible for Trump. So the balance of the world is definitely changing. Will China continue to be stable? We don't have a crystal ball, but certainly they have shown great resilience. The capitalist market, even in its limited way, is a big danger. China, it's a big danger. So far, they've been able to manage it because the state-owned industries and the planning is a much stronger part. And actually, in the economic crisis of 2008, who gets really hit hard in an economic crisis was the capitalists, and in China, and they didn't get bailed out. Instead, the state industries put a lot into infrastructure development in China, and that's important. And they strengthened a lot of the state industries. So we should take heart in that. Not a lot of time to comment on the Philippines' new president, Duterte. Certainly, Bayan has had very interesting analysis. It's a big, unexpected change for the U.S. What the Philippines has said is a realignment. You know that they hate it in the U.S. when suddenly he almost daily is being denounced as a drug dealer. And a killer of drug users. And that may be true because the Philippine popular organizations also hold him to account on that and have been sharp in criticizing him. But because of the strength of the movement in the Philippines, Duterte is forced to deal with them, and there's real negotiations going on with the armed movement in the Philippines. That's a big deal. So it's a question not of embracing him, recognizing who he is. He's a part of the ruling class, but sort of a maverick, not the ruling class. He's part of the political establishment, but kind of a maverick part, and he's made a big break because the problem of the Philippines was the same thing. What did the U.S. have to offer them? Could militarize, more bases, and yet the Philippines was so impoverished, its major export is its own human population. And its major income is the remittances that come home. There's no future in that, none. And so they do feel that an alliance of some kind with China will offer big infrastructure deals, and that's what's being discussed. And that shows a real change. This is the problem U.S. imperialism has. What can they offer any part of the world? Is war, militarism, and then they promise to rebuild, and they're incapable of it because there's no super profits in that. So they just leave Libya in ruins and Iraq in ruins and Afghanistan in super ruins and so on. So a lot of countries around the world are taking note of that. Ramiro asked important questions, and this could be, we could talk about this for days about, how about the new Silk Road, as it's called. This is a huge infrastructure program that stretches from China into Central Asia, the Middle East to Europe, and it will impact the economies of a whole number of countries. It's also a big frustration to the U.S. and also West European countries. They're not the drivers in this. They're used to being the drivers. They're used to being the controllers and doing it in ways that strictly benefits them. And the idea that there could be a whole infrastructure among a whole number of countries that works to their benefit and where there's whole new industries that grow up and communication is pretty threatening to them. But the new Silk Road is important. They will attempt to break it up. Absolutely. Will the U.S. attempt to break it up? Will they try to bring in mercenary forces and Contra forces and so on? And there's provinces much more sparsely populated in Sichuan and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing properly, Jingzhuan and where there's an all-out effort by the U.S. to see if they can't get in there. But the economic development may head that off and breaking up some of the isolation. I don't know. And of course, there's a long historic effort to try to use Tibet against China. And there also there's levels of development in Tibet now that are very, very high. So, but all these problems aren't solved. See, that's the thing. Every country has both underdevelopment and historic national oppression. I did want to comment on that. One of the speakers said, well, China was always a completely peaceful country. No, feudal China was an absolutely violent, really completely violent toward women. And class society is violent. And peasant society. And imperialism held that together, the feudal relations. While looting the country, really what they did was they reinforced the most backward elements of feudalism, as they do in Saudi Arabia, which would have long collapsed. People would have and have tried to rise up and take it over. Who reinforces feudal relations in Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the Gulf states is the U.S. And they reinforce the most feudal relations in China. And the Chinese Revolution, it both pushed the foreigners out, yes, but the big thing it did on the basic every village level was it just broke the power of the landlord class. It was a huge, they involved millions and millions of people into doing that, not just declaring it over, but involve them into actually taking the land and collectivizing the land. It was a very exciting historic accomplishment. The poverty rate in China has gone down so far. It's what allowed the UN to meet all its Millennium Goals. Completely failed throughout Africa and throughout Latin America, but they said, well, millions of people globally, hundreds of millions, were brought out of poverty. They didn't say how. They included China and Vietnam in the figures, who weren't part of the UN Millennium Goals, and the UN did nothing for, but by including them numerically, they said, see, we've achieved our goals. It's, it's more fraudulent, it's more fake news, fake figures, but millions of people have been pulled out of poverty in China, and that's not a small accomplishment. Modernization in all kinds of ways. So I think just one more point, sort of on the New Silk Road, because everything I was dealing with today was East China and the South China Sea, and where there's both extremely large population centers, huge trade, major cities. But part of China's struggle is also to develop the whole country, and the greatest backwardness and the most distances were in Western China. So there is a big effort to put a lot of investment money and a lot of infrastructure development and whatnot into Western China. And the New Silk Road is part of that. The trade with Russia is part of that. And it is very much the strategy that they have some little glimmer of hope. Can they somehow divide Russia and China? Can the U.S. do that? They succeeded in an earlier time. Could they do it again? Can they kind of lure Putin in with some deals with ExxonMobil and whatnot, some talk? Now, fool me once, will these countries be fooled again? We can certainly hope not. They have much more to gain in their relations and trade and exchange and even security with each other than any kind of alliance with U.S. imperialism. Will it be pushed with military threats? Yes. Can it be overcome? It certainly can. And for us here, we're going to be hit with lots of propaganda in the period ahead. That's natural. And so learning how to respond to it while being first and foremost in the struggle here. So, and the struggle here is really the struggle against racism, the struggle against absolute reaction, which they're going to pump up big time.